Internal Revenue Service IRS tax news. All taxpayers have the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. IRS Tax Tip 2021-23, February 23, 2021. When taxpayers complete their tax return, they may discover they will owe taxes. By law, they have the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax. This seems like a fairly uncontroversial type of thing. Obviously, you're going to be paying only the amount of taxes that you're legally required to pay. Therefore, when filing the tax return, you want to make sure that you're filing in compliance with the law, and while being in compliance with the law, taking advantage of any kind of deductions that are legally available to you. One reason this can be a little bit confusing is because we think about the policy, what should the law be, and then the application of the law. Once the law is what it is, what are we going to do in order to create the tax return with it? So for example, you might hear oftentimes people are saying, well, that person is taking advantage of this particular, quote, loophole, end quote, in the law. Now, oftentimes when you hear the word loophole, they're kind of insinuating that there's an error in the law. And again, oftentimes that's not really the case. It's just a law that they don't agree with, although it could be an error in the law. But the question really is, in terms of the tax return, the question is it something that's a legal deduction at that point in time or not? And if it is a legal deduction, you're only required to pay the taxes that you're legally required to pay. If you disagree with the law, if the law you think is incorrect and should be changed, that's not something that should be changed at the point in time that we create the tax returns, of course. That's something that should be taken in place with a policy debate so that we change the policy and change the actual law. And once the law is changed, then what you can do legally in terms of deductions will change along with it. So this is one of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. There's a link to the Bill of Rights here. These are fundamental rights taxpayers have when dealing with the IRS, one of which is the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax, including interest and penalties, and to have the IRS apply all tax payments properly. This means taxpayers are entitled to file for a refund if they believe they overpaid. So obviously, if you think you overpaid, then of course you file and you should be able to get the refund. And again, the concept behind that is that you shouldn't be required to pay any more taxes than you're legally required to pay. Write or call the IRS office that sent the notice or bill. Taxpayer can do this if they believe the notice or bill is incorrect in any way. So if you have something that you think is incorrect, the IRS is basically saying, this is what we think you owe based on this information, then you have the right to basically say, no, I think under the law, legally, according to the current situation, that's not correct. And you can basically argue with the IRS about the correctness of the law. And of course, when you're arguing about the correctness of the law is the foundation on which you're going to base your arguments, and the foundation on which the IRS will be basing their arguments. So when challenging information in a bill or notice, taxpayers should be ready to provide copies of any records that may help correct the error. If the taxpayer is correct, the IRS will make the necessary adjustments to their account and send a corrected notice. Amend a tax return if they discover an error. So if there is an error, then you do have a limitations, typically statute of limitation, like 3 years to basically amend it. So your requirement here is, once again, only to pay the taxes that you owe. If you figure out that, hey, I filed the taxes and I didn't have a deduction, or I reported too much income resulting in a higher amount of taxes than I would legally be required to owe, then you can basically file an amended tax return if you do so within a certain time frame, so that again, you don't pay as more taxes than you would owe. So they can also amend this return if they were mistakes in their filing status, income, deductions, or credits. Request any amount owed be removed if it's more than the correct amount due. Request the IRS remove any interest from their account if the IRS caused unreasonable errors or delays. So note, this one seems kind of straightforward because usually the interest that you pay you would think would be relatively low. But you can imagine situations where, if things got out of control, basically the IRS saying that you owe them money, they don't tell you about it for a long period of time, and then they charge you interest and penalties on top of basically the amount that you owe. And so that's if something is unreasonable in terms of how long they told you or the response time or something like that, then you can obviously see that can be a problem, and you shouldn't have to pay basically interest on something that was an unreasonable error or delay on the IRS's part. So typically when they do take action, they're very systematic about the action that they're going to take. They're going to say, hey, here's the letter, you got to respond in this amount of time. They'll send another letter out, and they'll try to be basically as consistent as possible to not have a situation where they basically just say, hey, you're wrong. We're going to come back 5 years from now and tell you you're wrong, and then charge you 5 years of penalties and interest on top of it. So submit an offer in compromise. Ask the agency to accept less than the full tax debt if the taxpayer believes they don't owe all or part of the tax debt. So an offer in compromise is something that is kind of a last resort typically for taxpayers that owe money. And oftentimes you're basically saying, you might take the position in an offer in compromise that, hey, look, this is the tax debt. Possibly it may even be right, but I don't think you're going to be able to collect that amount due to my circumstances, and possibly be able to negotiate an offer in compromise. In order to do that, there's certain steps that you would have to meet for an offer in compromise. This is an area that you probably want to do some research on, and if before you were to possibly hire someone to help you out with, say, an offer in compromise, to possibly look into lowering tax debt so you can get an idea of it. And just remember that this is kind of a specialty type of area, an offer in compromise. So you want to, if you are dealing with someone that's going to help you out possibly with an offer in compromise, make sure that you've kind of searched around for someone to help you out with that. And again, I would do the research first and get an idea of it. It's all on the IRS website. You know, it's kind of complicated, but it's all there, so you can see how the process works, so you have an understanding of it. So more information, Taxpayer Bill of Rights, there's a link to that here. Rights as a Taxpayer and Taxpayer Advocate Service, there's links to those items here. There'll be a link to this in the description.